Okay, sounds good.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Dr. Heather Zeng. I'm a faculty member at Capella University in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And we're just so grateful that the Chicago School has accepted our proposal to share Dr. Renzema's research. And I was his faculty chair. And his topic was mental health professionals' observations of heterosexual partnered men's justification of IPV or intimate partner violence. So quite a critical topic. And we're really looking at it in the hindsight as well as providing his results. And following up on the COVID climate, which has had some interesting interaction. So, welcome everyone. And whoops, I will go ahead and go over our learning objectives for today. Basically to expand the participants' insights into the thoughts and feelings of heterosexual partnered men entering mandated anger management and other programs as a result of having committed intimate partner violence en route to enhanced treatment planning, and really to look at the extent qualitative research on IPV and defining what recovery looks like. Will has some background in this as well, and then to Dr. Will, that is, and to discern future research, and also to kind of bring up some currency on the challenges of IPV and some of the paradoxes as well of the lockdown situation of present, and some are not so good internationally and in the US, and some are kind of a silver lining. So we'll go over the research study, the background, the method, analysis, research, and then the implications to the current COVID-19 context. So Dr. Renzema, do you want to introduce yourself and then start with this background?
Sure. Thank you very much, Heather. Dr. Zeng has been a really wonderful resource over this process. The thing that got me interested in this particular topic is as I did research, because having come from a home that was quite saturated with domestic violence, having gone to the Child Protective Services Agency locally, and having seen domestic violence continue to be just a major problem, it became interesting to me to try to find why people do this. And so in my research, I was never able to find anyone who had actually gotten the points of view of the perpetrators. And so that was the driving force behind this research. And Dr. Zeng has been such a great mentor in keeping me on track. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. So, these statistics are interesting, Will, that you found. They're pretty harrowing, aren't they?
Yes, very. And it's not really that uncommon to see, but it was surprising the numbers and the percentages that we found. It was really a high profile issue.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go to the next slide. So talk a little bit about your research and as a start here.
Of course. What we did was looked at current domestic violence, intimate partner violence research, what had been done. And we could not find any research that had actually ascertained what the perpetrator's motivations were. Now, I'm very much focused on the clinical ends of things. And so I knew that I would be treating these kinds of situations. So much of my interest was what works, what hasn't worked, what can work, what are our options. So that was one of the driving forces behind what I was doing. So next slide. And here are some facts about what we found. Just harrowing amounts of IPV. 1 in 4 U.S. couples have some form of IPV, and current treatment efforts to reduce the incidence have not been effectual. So we decided there was some basic research to gain a contributing factors to that data to see where we could go from there. So the research
Mhm.
question was, and Heather, I'm going to need to move our picture a bit
Oh,
because
yeah, yeah,
it's covering
sure,
part of what I'm
sure.
reading. Here we go. What are the impressions of professionals who work directly with IPV perpetrators regarding the perpetrator's justifications, their thoughts and feelings for their abusive actions? And that was asked very constructively in the social constructionism theory. And of course, what social construction confirms is that the most of the accurate comments are the ones that are likely to have been influential. So we had a lot of reasons to question people who are currently doing this and how that affected their income and their contributions to the process. Next slide. So here are some of the most severe types of IPV. Now, the first one up here it was actually confirmed by the research, and that's a characterological violence. Now, these are the personality disorders, and these people don't really respond well to treatment. Most of
Mhm,
these people, when they are abusing, find that they become more and more calm, more and more
mm,
in control, and
mhm,
more and
mhm,
more doing what they think will work for them. Many of them are just, these are the most severe types. Most of these people are incarcerated. You
mm,
don't really
mhm.
see too many of them. But the
Yeah,
one,
I've been
yeah,
watching the Hemingway biography, and not to disparage Hemingway, he was a beautiful writer, but he might fall into this category where he became quite calm,
right,
in his sensibility in each of the relationships. So we all can think of like archetypes of this.
right. I found few professionals who were treating these people successfully. I found one man who had found a way to work with these people, and it was nearly all these people when they came out of incarceration. They were assigned to him. He loved them. He had success with them. Frankly, I never understood it, but he did.
Yeah, that's always exciting, because we need those people, right?
Yes, we do.
Mhm.
But most IPV happens in the situational couple violence. And the situation escalates, the emotions rise between both partners. And finally, the perpetrator just is out of control. And then it goes on into IPV.
Mm.
And treatment processes that we have as examples, number one was a Duluth model, and it was designed more of a just kind of a taking you and just making you feel badly about what you did, and I didn't find that very attractive.
No, I think it doesn't fall into your sensibility at all, and I think many people, that's what's exciting about your research is that it really purports that there's a better way, isn't there? You know.
Exactly. And
Mhm.
as I redid this research, my whole purpose was the clinical effects. And that was where I was headed because I wanted some ability to work with these people. And by the way, I have been, and it's been relatively successful.
Yeah. So the rubber hits the road. I always call myself an applied academic. And I think that's why I was so excited supporting your research, because I knew that this was going to make a difference, the implications to understand this.
Yes, and
So,
it does. It was very eye-opening to me. I think that the research gave me all the tools I needed to help people who are caught in this. So I really did appreciate it. So next slide. Are
the
you up?
methodology, yeah. Dr. Will used a generic qualitative methodology, phenomenological to restrictive, and
Yes.
his population was treatment professionals. Of course, you know, to work with clients, it's just too high risk for any IRB. So he queried treatment professionals, and the sample members were from the Riverside and San Bernardino counties. That's in Southern California, where we're both located in Northern California. But non-probability purpose sampling was used, and he interviewed 10 sample members, and the interview questions were designed by him. And this is kind of the overview of the sample population, where you can see the gender, age, race, and experience treating IPV, intimate partner violence, education, and their license. And again, so we had really a great trajectory from some folks really starting off to mid-career to a longevity in the field.
Great.
So Will asked 11 interview questions, and you know, we can provide you with a copy of this research, but you know, some of them, we'll just read a few. You know, what did these problems between partners reportedly, when did they begin to develop? Or, you know, what did perpetrators report was the factor that precipitated the IPV, which is so critical? You know, what the most recent incident was developing, what were their feelings? You know, what were their reported thoughts, to get kind of a sense of that mental map. He furthered it with, you know, why did these incidents proceed to become physical, right? Because that's kind of a denouement or a turning point.
Exactly.
In the, and then, you know, who did the perpetrator say was to blame? You know, this is a real interesting kind of construct, right? In terms of getting a sense of where you can go cognitively or behaviorally with someone.
Exactly.
And,
yes.
you know, how did they feel and think about the incidents? Any of these other ones you want to highlight, Will?
Well, I think as we look at the results, it'll become more obvious which ones were critical, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
the interviews recorded and transcribed, they were heard several times by myself and 3 other people. The inductive analysis process was undertaken. Now, there were certain key themes that rose out of it, and many of these were confirmed by previous research,
mm-hmm.
and confirmed by the social constructionism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
So,
There was nearly always, these are the kind of the results that we found. There was always externalized the blame for the incidents. And to be really clear, when you deal with them clinically, these are the issues that would have to be looked at and addressed. Abuse
mm-hmm.
situations typically preceded by a plethora of the perpetrators' negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they usually focus on getting their own needs met, it's a very selfish kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when there was not that, the perpetrators just, it was such an interesting thing. They don't know what happened. Without any precognition, the whole thing just snapped, and suddenly they're abusing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also, after the incident was over, they all had trouble admitting what they had did. They minimize it and deny it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
Now,
your themes were fascinating, I thought, you know.
right. Now, as we have dealt with these, as it's become a clinical issue, they've kind of had to fall into a category that works well with as they are dealing with. And the most important one was that they nearly always blame someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and that has been the issue dealing with it clinically to approach. You know, they
Yeah,
made
and in the literature, was that common too? Refresh my
exactly.
memory.
Yes,
Yeah.
very
So that external focus is like an external locus of control.
exactly.
And so it's really trying to get that sensibility. And, the emotion outcomes were interesting too, Dr. Will, because I think, the Dalai Lama has recently worked with a major researcher, Paul Ekman, and his daughter, who's followed on this Atlas of Emotions.
Yes.
And I think that could be an interesting tool. The applications aren't really broad right now,
Yes.
but it gives someone a sense of how emotions work, and we're not taught that, right? Not
No,
to minimize folks in these situations that get quite violent, but I think that could be another resource for people to query and see in this field, to see like how could they use that to visualize where their emotions are at or were at.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Mm.
And what I find is many of these perpetrators are so dependent upon emotions, and to cross over to, well, wait a minute, what's logically here is one of the big struggles that they have. So that's one of the points I make in trying to deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not easy, but they do finally get there if you keep working with them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting that either gender could be the perpetrator, and I have both situations in my caseload, and where alcohol or drugs has been an effect as well. It's been a good resource, this whole research for dealing directly with them clinically.
Yeah. And do you see anyone doing more expansion other than your insights on the feminist space Duluth model, or even when we look at intersectionality of immigrants and minorities and, MCT competencies? Do you see anything out there?
It's definitely needed,
Mhm.
especially when you start looking at other countries where the situation for the female is just lower in power. Then it becomes really important, and at this point, that hasn't been the case in the cases I've been working with. There's pretty much kind of an equal power level, and that's been a good platform to work from.
Okay. So, and then recommendations. What were some of the recommendations for treatment? You mentioned some of them already.
Sure.
Um,
One of the ones I have used that is not researched, but it does work, is to teach people that anger, which is the base of IPV, comes on a continuum. In other words, when they're at rage and they're out of control, they've popped into the worst of it.
mhm,
But
mhm,
there are lower steps which they can confront if they're willing to take that responsibility.
mhm,
And of course, anger has a lot of different names, everywhere. But what I found is that when they're arguing, they're already heading that way.
mm,
And one of the steps below that is this passive aggressiveness.
mm.
So those are emotions and thoughts that we confront. And
And anger can be depression, right?
yes, it can. Yes.
So that's something that one should consider is, what's the threshold of that,
Right. Yes. And that is part of one of the particular couple of cases that I'm dealing with. But many of them start as they're frustrated with what's going on. And
Mhm,
before that, they just are not satisfied with something. There's something that's bothering them. The earlier they can recognize those emotions, the more control they have over them. And
mhm,
a lot of the training that I do is, okay, where did this start?
mhm,
What did you feel?
mhm,
When did the frustration start? What could you
mhm.
have done then?
Yeah. As we're talking, and I know we're kind of doing this as conversational, but I think that I just presented with another doctoral student on non-Western approaches like Morita therapy, and it really does focus around moving through feelings and emotions. So it would be interesting to see even non-Western approaches, that
Exactly.
kind of,
Yes.
so I mean, and to see, what they've found. So anyway, so what were your recommendations? Some of the limitations, and then your future recommendations.
Well, I think that one of the main limitations is that there just isn't enough research out there.
Hmm.
And there is research out there, but it isn't, as I've seen it, too focused on clinical work. And so much of what without that research, some of it I've just had to kind of develop myself. But I think it definitely needs to expand the geographical limitations because this is a worldwide problem. It's not just here in Western society.
Hmm. And
And
we'll share a little bit more that post-COVID, post his research and post, pre kind of the start of COVID, what some findings have been, which are really interesting.
yes, and I really appreciate the work you did with that. That's going to be a very interesting part here.
Mhm.
So it's going to be interesting to see how this all develops in terms of research and how it can be applied toward clinical issues. It's going to be exciting for me to see.
Yeah. And you know what? As I think of, too often folks think theory is so challenging, but there's so many people in the trenches doing things. So, I think the call for counselor educators or doctoral students or even practitioners is really to get the word out. If you're having efficacy with some approach, to get with folks in academic settings to validate it. And to say, hey, this, to build on that Duluth model or
Yes,
the theoretical approaches and kind of work. It's not backwards, but it's looking at what's working and then move to the empiricism and say, study it and say, does this actually have the efficacy that you're purporting in the natural environment of the field,
exactly.
and that's why these practitioner, counselor, educator conversations have to be so rich. And we actually have to carve out time for that because these are, I always call it the rubber hits the road,
Exactly.
and this is what's really going to make societal issues like this better is getting to that empiricism and bringing everyone on board. It's not just an academic silo. It's not just a practitioner. It's the marriage of both.
Exactly. Yes.
So, what about other research? You mentioned other research suggested by sample participants that you interviewed.
Yes. Right.
Hmm.
Each of the people I interviewed had ideas of what they felt they needed that would help them to further their clinical work. Of course, these are all people who were working directly with IPV perpetrators.
Hmm.
And and it was interesting to see these questions, like one of them is how treatment professionals' attitudes affect treatment outcomes. And that's a personal exam thing that's got to be done. And
Absolutely. I mean, and you were very honest about your own bracketing of your experiences, and I imagine you still have to do that as you work with clients because there can be triggers, right?
yes, yes, there is. One of the more difficult clients I'm dealing with right now just has no insight as to why he did it. And he's just like white knuckling it. And we are
Mhm.
just about to approach the issues of, okay, what's going on here? Why
Mhm.
did it happen? How can you move forward? And
Mhm.
right now he's just kind of frozen up, but we're breaking him loose a piece at a time.
It's a process, huh? And
Yes,
I think it speaks to the need for consultation or a mentoring group that you have with
yes,
peers, to really who are working in similar fields to really kind of continue with that objectivity, right? Um,
exactly. Yes.
mm. So, so yeah, so in summary, the results were definitely used by counselors, therapists, psychologists, researchers, learners, and policies. I think the policymaker thing is huge,
Yes. Yes.
Because really, we're seeing, even for example, with hate crimes in the US, there's to categorize it, it's very hard. So, how are policymakers moving to really categorize, or even providing a balance of the social systems that can ameliorate these challenges that people have, right?
Yes.
So, we kind of, what do they say? You can tell a society by how they treat the young and the aged,
Yes.
so
Right.
it's kind of like, this is, relationship. I always used to joke when I did policy work in education, the family and consumer sciences, they always called it making pillows and biscuits, but they were teaching relationship and life planning and those things. And some of that, is the wayside with more academic standards and high school and so forth. And they may very well, this might forecast some of those things people just don't know if they're in these environments of, intimate partner violence, and they see that and that's all they know. So,
And
so
I
I'll
think
let you.
that the point you bring up is very, very real. That one of the things we need to take a look at is those who have witnessed this, how effective is the experiences they've had as younger people in their own homes? How much influence does that have?
Yeah, that generational transmission.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what other summary findings did you find?
Well, one of the most important ones, I think, was that they jumped from this straight to suddenly they're abusing. It's like it just suddenly snapped and there they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been a good tool to use in saying to them, how did you get there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So kind of the CBT
Right.
approaches, and looking at dysfunctional, or kind of the map doesn't match the land, kind of
Yes.
like, what that is, where and they're not seeing that disjoint. And
Right.
group therapy too. Uh, you noted that did you say that could be helpful,
Oh,
or
well, yes, it does. The group therapy thing has been especially helpful with people who are reluctant to accept their own responsibility for what they felt.
Mhm.
Because then there's those around the room who have been there and they say, oh, come on.
You're right. You're right. Yeah, and anger management training too. Uh, uh, how effective has that been?
Well, I have a few people doing that right now.
Hmm.
Many of them do not apply what is taught. It's um, it's unfortunate because it's very valuable information, but it is a way to mitigate some of the emotion, some of the thoughts. It does help them recognize early when things are going wrong and gives them a couple of options, good options of how to send that a different direction.
Mm-hmm. And then couples therapy, in terms of having efficacy for some of the precursors, but that would have to be that folks have some sensibility around that something's awry, that um,
Yes, I find that I do have two sources of types of people that I work with, and one is in couples therapy,
mhm,
and
mhm,
some of them are not doing well, others are doing quite well.
mhm,
And I have
mhm,
right now I'm counseling a young woman who is a psychologist at an institution where men are incarcerated. She
mm,
has a great view of what's going on, but the couples area of it is not going well for her,
yeah,
and that makes it difficult to support because she has to make decisions for herself and
mhm,
and without response from the partner, and so it's difficult because you end
right.
up working with just one instead of both.
Yeah, and you know, that from what I understand and some of the research that you uncovered in your literature review is kind of a spiraling. You know, it's like there's like you know, the things happen. You know, there's some kind of resolution short term, and then there's another peak, and you know,
Yeah.
it's almost like a constant, almost like an EKG. You know, like
Yes.
you know, like a visual. So interesting. And you know what, these are some post research you know, critical furthering that we kind of called it, that we wanted to share. And some of it starts with the international research after COVID. And what's nice is we have a Capella has a COVID database, so we can really just query the research. And so, you know, what we found is, you know, in many low-income countries like Nigeria, I've worked with a couple USIA projects in Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, with women leaders. And, you know, this is a real issue. So, you know, some of this research spoke to the folks that I've worked directly with. And you know, there's no public shelters. Infrastructure is bad. So perhaps, you know, if you were to query someone, you know, your cellular resource might be down, or your internet, you know, where you might connect with someone
Right.
online to chat. So essential, some areas it's variable, but some essential aspects of access to even communication is challenging. And so, you know, the research concluded definitely, you know, it's grossly underfunded. A lot of NGO organizations can only do so much, you know, and with COVID, you know, there's some cultural milieu where there can be a sense of where, you know, of superstition around certain, you know, types of ailments and such, and
Right.
sometimes women are kind of scapegoated around that. So we looked at the Nigeria research. We also looked at you know, they said in France, they saw a 36% increase in the number of reported intimate partner violence cases. And in one city in China, they reported a twofold increase in IPV cases in 1 month after the restrictions of COVID. And you know, police said that 90% of the causes were kind of the stressors and, you know, of COVID in the IPV cases, you know, that there was kind of, you know, things were, there was already a layer of stress, and that exacerbated it. And, you know, the one interesting thing, and I'm sure you saw this too, was in France, they used code words at the pharmacies for folks who were experiencing, because if they were getting medicine, or, you know, it was part of their normal routine, albeit, you know, the people had to have like a letter to go out, you know, to during COVID. That was seen as somewhat helpful, that to help individuals as kind of a stopgap, at least, you know, to get some help in the midst of it. Um, and then, you know, the French government actually had hotel rooms for survivors of IPV, and, you know, some of the industries that were affected. So sometimes that, they said in the research, was paradoxical, because it helped, like if you worked in the hotel industry, it helped the person to, they would have to stay at the hotel. So if they were experiencing IPV, then they were locked away from the person who maybe had been inflicting it, or vice versa. And so paradoxically, it reduced some aspects of IPV, which is interesting, right? You know? Um, And the bottom line is, they said that really a typical timeline for research is, you know, dramatically slower than the phenomenon, you know. And I think
Yes.
Dr. Will found that too, that, you know, even the Duluth model, there hasn't been really advancement, you know, right? I mean, it's the,
Yes.
you know,
Right.
and so this really shows that, you know, when you have kind of a natural disaster situation, which COVID is kind of a pandemic, that, you know, if you're already responding dramatically slower to the social phenomenon, then, you know, you already are behind the curve. So
Yes.
it's so important in times of like maybe less flux or not a pandemic to really be working on these. And Canada actually earmarked $30 million for shelters and sexual assault centers. They seem to be very progressive around this, and they also looked at supporting Indigenous services in the Yukon to support women who are fleeing violence. So that was kind of a really good thing to see. And then in Zimbabwe, you know, they noted that while COVID-19 is unparalleled, they were really looking at the church and spiritual pastoral care roles by the church. And we'll provide you guys with the reference listing if you're interested in all of this current COVID IPV research, and maybe you can further something. But Will, don't you think that's interesting too? In the US, that's underutilized. Do you think, the spiritual component?
I think so. It is. I think that some people are reluctant to deal with the issue because they have no training.
Yeah, that lay persons, it's too complex and
Right.
layered. And so I guess, you know, in this case, they were really, you know, there's some social context of saying, well, this is everywhere. Maybe this could be a harbor for folks, and then maybe, you know, looking at further advocacy by experts, you know.
Right. Yes, I
Yeah.
have had some success with a couple who came to me coming out of IPV and wanting to be taught more on the church's point of view, and came up with some real solutions. And every time I see them, they're so grateful. You know, it's just
Oh, wow, that's really good. And so, you know, that's another avenue that I think if folks are in community-based organizations, I know I've been involved in our tri-faith interface, interfaith service a group, and you know, that could be a really, you know, something for discussion in communities of, you know, maybe you're not an expert, but maybe that, you know, there can be just like often homelessness is tackled as a social issue by spiritual organizations. You know, it could be one that you look at on your agenda, you know?
exactly, yes. And sometimes offering just social help when
Hmm.
things get tough because of COVID and jobs start to go away, offering food, offering used clothing, offering those kind of things just helps relieve the stress and very often can make a difference.
Hmm. And then actually, this was quite an interesting article on Spain versus Italy. And the author shared really the Italian government took kind of an inform about, you know, the tipping point of gender-based violence. And whereas Spain really approved kind of a decree and took a holistic approach to protect victims. So, you know, in kind of the article sensibility and sharing of this policy was really kind of, you know, saying that, you know, there's some cultural nuances, right, and that are very complicated. Um, and protocols, but they could agree that there are some, you know, that things that need to be more actionable than just informing folks and seeing how it lands, you know, because these are people's lives, and oftentimes, you know, children and family systems are just, you know, just really wreaked havoc.
It's interesting that any country's particular social structure has a bearing on that and how they proceed.
Hmm. Yeah. And even some of the maybe the genderized treatment or historical history around the government's role, right? You know,
Yep.
like, uh-huh. And then the UK actually The design of the study was looking at kind of IPV and the major life events, and they confirmed that notable to the science, this finding that unique to mothers who became like homeless, that physical IPV dropped drastically and temporarily from childbirth through the first 8 months of the child's life. And then the study also found that the social and macroeconomic policies on homelessness, to vulnerable subgroups really was, something that you had to take into consideration because individuals had different needs. And as we know in counseling, individuation really prevails. So does this resonate with you in terms of, the critical life events too, or?
Definitely. I find that very often when a particular person is about to retire and they know that their life is changing altogether, very often that's a sensitive spot on how do we proceed from here. And I have a couple of families I'm dealing with around that right now. Another issue that comes up is when there's medical issues around a particular member of the marriage, and they become less productive. They become more sedentary, and very often they blame that on the partner, and will kind of strike out.
And then we also looked at northern Ethiopia, and the housewives and young women were were 18 times more likely to suffer from violence than those who were employed. Of course, some of that might resonate even in the U.S. Is that true, Will?
Yes, I find that very often when a particular member of the dyad is working and the other one is not, it's like they feel they have more power and can use it against the other one. It's a factor that really needs to be researched.
Yeah, it's a leverage, right? And
Yes.
maybe some aspects of isolation, right? That limiting their extended network and
Yes.
Access. I know in the research or the USIA work that I did with French-speaking African women, that access to capital was like their primary focus because everything else would get better after that because that was that leverage, right?
Exactly.
So I know that the Bill Gates Foundation has done some great work on creating, electronic ways and for them to access capital, that is. And, identifying high risk individuals is really that proactive stance that, this Ethiopian research talked about. And then also finally in Turkey, in our research, we found that the place of residence was really a determinant. So people in urban areas, maybe had higher exposure to economic violence compared to those in a rural area. And specifically the region that the women affected, this kind of economic violence where they would withhold resources in some way, one of the partners. And it was found that women living in the Western or Central and Southern regions had a higher possibility of exposure to economic violence. And they found that, of course, alcohol, was linked to this economic violence in terms of, excessive use. And then, of course, as Dr. Will has stated, that individuals who've experienced or witnessed violence in childhood appear to be more prone and that cycle of abuse. And then the U.S. updates, you want to share a little bit on these, Will?
Yes. One of the things that we found in the research is that it's still proceeding. And it's very typical in urban areas that there's more of an equal power structure between men and women. And that frequency then is among those who had reported any past year physical IP women. So the history of it then did also kind of contribute to the addition of it. And individual psychological factors, these were found in the research I did as well. if the childhood experience was impulsivity and really positively associated with frequency and the severity, it was tended to be repeated. It was unfortunately, it was one of the big factors.
Yeah, and then the Northern California research also, really looked at this dyadic behavior, future studies, both members, and I think that's what you really have noted, like some limitation that some will participate, one will participate and not the other,
Right. Yeah.
and then also the neighborhood related factors. I think, it just really, all of these together really cry for that community-based kind of, especially in socially disadvantaged populations, to really, I connected to this when I used to work with parents in a very impoverished area of Miami and Florida. And, a lot of parents might brag that they were hyper disciplinary with their kids. And I said, well, where do you go where you don't make any choices? You don't let people make choices. You end up in jail. So you're going to need to let them make choices and make small mistakes. And I'll never forget, I had a student who was a policeman, and he was like, oh, can I use that? can I say that? And I said, it was very bold of me because I was not of the community. But you see these cycles, right? Where if you do not allow people choices, then when they do make the choice, it's going to be a big bad choice, So anyway, I think that this kind of community-based, wellspring, if you want to call it, is exciting, huh? That this could be helpful.
Absolutely, and the branches of it just go everywhere. Anything you can do to help out a family that is at risk reduces the likelihood. One of the things I am involved in is making sure that families in my area who are lacking in food, lacking in resources, lacking in ways to purchase things that the family needs, is we make it a point to get from several agencies that donate, grocery stores, and places where they're going to give stuff away. And we gather that stuff and then make it available to families in need. And
I think that's such a testament to you, and that we can all model your lead there, Will.
It is a resource that everybody needs, and it does relieve stress on the family.
And then the Dallas, Texas study, showed that there appeared to be an increase in violence in the first 2 weeks after the stay-at-home order, and then it tended to decrease. But they said that the short-term spike might be associated with what was already occurring, in terms of a rise in domestic violence pre-stay-home orders. So they were kind of careful to kind of say that it stayed that way. They had, like much research, it's limited by a point in time. But they said that, in rural communities, there was a caveat because a lot of them didn't have the shelter in place. So, that might have had an effect where individuals, may have either been able to flee because they couldn't, they could leave, or that they were saying that that maybe they did not come to the attention of the police department. Maybe there were bigger fish to fry at that, not to minimize this, but,
Sure.
in terms of attention. And of course, we have seen some increases because of that. You're saying that resource deprivation that of, criminal activities. So,
Sure.
certainly in the pecking order of mediating things, it can look very differently in police departments as to what they can do. And so, I would definitely take a look at this Picaro study and the methodology that they used for the 83-day period before the stay at home, and then the 35. So again, it's a little limited in snapshot in time. And there's so much more emerging. So we really encourage you to, keep up with it. I just want to again say it's been a real gift to be Dr. Renzema's department chair for his, or not department chair, but his chair for his research. And he, in addition to being a therapist, he also teaches at Calvary Chapel University, and also taught at Azusa Pacific.
Yes.
And then, and yeah, and we have some references and recommended readings. And on our last slide, we have our email. If you email us, we're happy to provide the presentation in a PDF and also the references. I will pause there. Are there any questions? Any in the chat? Let's see. Yeah, thank you so much, Colleen. So we'll just take a minute and see if there's any questions, or anyone want to come off of mute and share any of your insights or reflections. We'd love to hear from you. I know that in California it's the lunchtime, but others in other time zones don't have an excuse. But you know, again, we're just so pleased that you attended, and if you feel, you know, you'd like to reach out, Will, your email's there, and
Yes.
then myself, and you know, Will was the lead researcher on this, so he is the expert who can answer the most questions on this. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Zeng.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Colleen. I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you all for attending. And we encourage you to, you know, work in your communities, as Dr. Will is saying, you know, large and small activities to support individuals in distress can really be helpful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been wonderful. Thank you all for their presentation. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Colleen. Be well.